Okay, can everyone hear me?
Perfect. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, Tess. Thanks to Helmets and the team for having me here this year. So just to introduce myself, my background is as a research scientist back in the day. I've spent the last 20 years working in the brand protection industry, and in the last year I've moved to Stobbs, which is a brand advisory consultancy. They offer a number of legal and IP related services, and I've come in to kind of help consult on the brand protection side of things. So I've got a slightly unusual background in the industry, but what that's done is it's given me kind of an opportunity to apply that scientific background that I've got into the area of brand protection analysis, which is what I've spent most of my career doing. So that's what I'll be talking about. It's going to be illustrated with a series of case studies, and that will form the base, the bulk of this presentation. So just as an overview of what I'm going to talk about, so I'm just going to give a very quick introduction to what brand protection is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, and then talk about how there's really a couple of different areas within that scientific analysis can lend itself to. Those two main areas are filtering, prioritizing, and clustering results from the typically large database of findings that we get when we're monitoring for content relating to a particular brand. And also getting insights into infringement patterns and the general landscape that's out there. The rest of this slide is just kind of giving you an overview of the case studies that we'll be looking at, but I'll go through those as we get to them. So this is a bit of a busy slide. Apologies that there's quite a lot on it. Don't worry too much about all of the content. Really, the idea here is to say what brand protection is. So essentially what we're doing, we will be working for a number of big brands, looking online to identify content that is potentially damaging to them, and then having that content taken down where appropriate. So really there's two or three parts to that. The first part is the process of monitoring and discovery. So that's finding the infringing or egregious content, analyzing that content to sort of prioritize and filter it down, and then doing enforcement against the things that need taking down. As part of that, we identify a range of different types of infringement, which is represented by the four colored boxes at the top. So we've got counterfeit goods and e-commerce related infringements. We have online fraud, we have digital piracy, and then we have other brand issues. So that can cover a range of different things: logo abuse, false claims of affiliation, things like genericism, where a brand name is being used by third parties in a generic sense, and that can kind of devalue the brand over time. So think of brands like Hoover, Band-Aid, Kleenex, Xerox, Google, where actually their brand name has kind of just become a generic term for the type of product or service that they're offering. There's some information on that slide that gives you sort of a flavor of the scale of the issues, sort of the billions of dollars that are affected by these types of issues. I won't go through that now, but if anyone wants to delve into that in more detail, the slides will be available afterwards, and I can share any of that information with you if that's useful. If you look at the bottom of the slide, again, quite busy, but what I'm trying to sort of convey there is that as part of a brand protection service, really what you're looking to do is cover things holistically. So you're looking at a range of different channels, so domain names, of course, but also general internet content, social media, e-commerce marketplaces, and so on. And really, there's a lot of overlap increasingly in these different areas. So you really need to monitor them all together to kind of make sense of the infringement landscape. There's a few different ways that you can get that data. So for domain names, we will typically look at things like domain name zone files, which give you these comprehensive lists of all the registered domains. We can do things like parallel lookups to get increased coverage over things like ccTLDs, where maybe the zone files are not available. And then there's a number of other techniques we use to collect data, so sending queries to search engines, doing direct searches on individual sites, marketplaces, platforms that we're interested in. But really within that, domain names do sit in an area of key importance. They typically, if you've got a branded domain name that's infringing in some ways, typically it will be more highly search engine ranked than maybe a non-branded domain name. It is an explicit abuse of IP, so therefore there are greater enforcement options available. And there is the possibility for abuse even when there's no live website content. So quite often if we find a domain has been registered and it has an active MX record, that may be an indication that that domain is being used to send spam or phishing emails. So this is a sort of little schematic of how brand protection sits together with domain name management. Really the idea here is that the bit in the middle is the portfolio of official domains that a brand owner company will own. So typically there will be the core domains that they use for their website, email, typical kind of classic business infrastructure purposes. And then outside of that, there will be an additional tactical portfolio of domains that the brand owner will own, but maybe is not actively using at the current time. Some of those may be defensive registrations that have been held to prevent them being used by third parties. Some of them may be strategic domain registrations, which are being held to be used in the future. They may relate to new brands that are being launched, new geographic areas that the brand is planning to expand into, and so on. I guess the thing to take away from this is, you will always have, as a brand owner, a tactical domain portfolio, but you can't possibly register every possible domain name variant that could be used by an infringer. So this is why domain name management should always be accompanied by an online brand protection program. And what that's really looking to do, that's looking at the area outside the firewall, if you like. So that's looking at activity by third parties. That's more of a sort of proactive approach to looking at what the other people are doing. If you find something that's egregious, then taking it down. There's a number of reasons why that's important. Brand protection has a number of purposes, as you can see on the bottom left there. So protecting your IP, protecting your customers, and so on. But actually, from an IP management point of view, being seen to be proactively enforcing against infringements is really important, because it can actually be a prerequisite for keeping your IP protection in place, keeping your trademarks registered, and so on. Okay, so as I touched on in the very beginning, there's really a couple of main areas where sort of these analysis ideas are appropriate. The first, as I said, is filtering and prioritizing results and clustering results together. So the reason that's important is when you set up a brand monitoring service looking for content that might be of interest on the internet to a brand owner, typically you will get back a lot of data. So really what you need to do is firstly prioritize and filter that. So filtering is kind of getting rid of things like false positives, so maybe unrelated references to the brand name, which, particularly if you've got a brand like Apple or Orange, which is a kind of key, a very common word in its own right, you want to get rid of some of those false positives. And then with what's left, you want to sort of prioritize it. So what's worth looking at in more detail first, and then what are the things maybe you want to take prioritized action against. As part of that, there is this idea of clustering, which is building links between related infringements. And again, there's a few reasons why that can be useful. It can help you identify who your key infringers are. So they're the people you take action against first. If you find that there are, for example, lots of infringing domains that are linked to each other, you can take them down all in one go through some sort of bulk takedown action. If you can identify that an infringer has been involved in lots of different activities, you can build a stronger case of bad faith action, and so on. The other area, other than filtering and prioritizing, is this kind of getting insights into the landscape and patterns of infringement. And there's a few different areas really where that kind of can come into play. And we'll touch on some of those a little bit later. So this is, again, quite a busy slide here, but really, I guess the thing to take away from this is there's a number of different criteria or characteristics of websites or domain names that you can use as a basis for prioritizing which ones are the ones you should be looking at first or be most concerned about. So things like, if you brought back a load of web pages about a particular brand, one of the easiest things you can do is to say, okay, which are the pages that are most about this brand? So you can look for things like the presence and the prominence of keywords on the page. And there's a whole suite of other characteristics you can look at. And a lot of these are sort of domain name related characteristics. And where they're particularly kind of a special case, if you like, is some of those can be used even if there's not yet any live website content present. So some of the characteristics of a domain name in itself will give you some sort of guidance as to how likely that domain name may be to be used for nefarious purposes in the future. So again, I'll just run through a few of them there. So things like host country. So we find, for example, that sites hosted in particular countries, maybe places like Russia and China, where there are typically high rates of infringement or difficulty in actually getting sites taken down, they can be popular with infringers for those reasons. Who the registrar is. So we'll find that certain lower cost providers tend to be popular with infringers. Some even kind of, for hosting providers, some actually even build themselves as bulletproof. So their business model is, we won't take something down just because the brand owner tells us to. So essentially they're operating kind of in an illegal basis, but that is their business model. The type of brand reference in a domain name can be important. So if someone is using a deliberate typo or a misspelling, that can be an indication that they're planning to set up a deceptive website. Maybe they're deliberately using some sort of variation to circumvent detection. Different TLDs, again, we've touched on this in some of the previous sessions. So some TLDs tend to be more popular with infringements, and that can be down to things like how easy and cheap the domains are to register. Who the SSL certificate provider is. Now, obviously, back in the day, we're always told that, you know, if a site has an SSL certificate, if you can see the padlock in the address bar, then it's a safe site. That's really no longer the case. There are plenty of SSL providers who really don't check who the people are who are trying to buy these certificates. And really, they're no longer any sort of effective indicator of trust. There was actually a recent study that showed 80% of sites that are explicitly involved in phishing activity have SSL certificates. They've got the padlock in the address bar. So you really just need to look at more who the provider of that certificate is. Domain name entropy is quite an interesting one. It's represented by for those who are mathematically minded, the formula on the right. Really what it is, it's just telling you, it's giving you a measure of how long and random a domain name is. So the higher the domain name entropy, the more it's kind of got lots of random unrepeated characters in it. That can be quite useful in its own right, as we'll see on some of the later slides. But really the idea is you can pull all of these characteristics together and it gives you the possibility to construct an overall threat scoring system for every result that you bring back, and that allows you to work out which ones you want to tackle in the first instance. So now onto the case studies. So this is the only case study I'm going to talk about that kind of illustrates the use of sort of filtering techniques. So this was really a kind of proof of concept, if you like. What we did was we ran some general searches for Gucci, just as the brand name, almost just like plugged it into Google and see what comes back, plus a few product and e-commerce related keywords. So things like buy, sale, cheap. And that brought back, and this very kind of quick sampling exercise we did, that brought back 2,000 pages that might be selling counterfeit Gucci products. And the idea there is, what can we then do to actually bring to the top those ones that are really genuinely the ones that result to websites that actually may be doing this egregious activity? So what we did here is we used a proximity scoring system, which is represented by the graph at the top right. Essentially what we did is we picked a series of what we know are high-risk keywords, the types of keywords that tend to be used by sites that are explicitly selling counterfeit products. So things like dupe, mirror quality, things that are being used to describe counterfeit products, but are not typically used by sites that are selling legitimate products. And we scored each page based on how close any of those keywords were to the brand name we were monitoring for. What that then gave us is a kind of ranked set of those 2,000 websites, and the ones that float to the top are exactly the ones that we're interested in finding, the ones that are explicitly selling replica products, counterfeits. So these would typically be our first targets for enforcement. So we're going to be jumping around a bit. So there's a few kind of fairly different case studies in the presentation that really illustrate different aspects of what I want to talk about. So this is an analysis of a high volume domain-based phishing campaign that I worked on actually in my previous role between 2020 and 2021. So what happened here is we saw that there was a large coordinated phishing campaign actually also being sent out, in this case through SMS messaging, and they were using brand-specific domain names to target a FTSE 100 banking group, so one of our not quite so legitimate uses of SMS messaging across that period. We were able to establish that it was all really part of a single attack by the fact that the domain names that were being used had a number of similarities between them. So this is kind of an illustration of the clustering idea I was talking about. So they had similarities in things like registration dates, keyword patterns, URL structure, and so on. What we were able to do when we kind of looked at the data, we were able to sort of see subjectively that, the first of the two brands that was targeted in a period over a couple of months, and then that died off, and then the second brand within the group was targeted. And actually what we're doing here, what we were then able to do is plot the daily numbers of domain registrations mentioning those two brands. And actually we were able to pick up that phishing campaign in the overall level of activity. So really what the thing we saw here is that the number of domains used in this phishing campaign was so high that it actually dominated the overall pattern of all domains registered for containing that brand name over the period we're interested in. So this is just kind of one way you can see how sort of looking at the domain registration activity allows you to track the progress of the campaign. Obviously, we could have filtered it down and looked at just the ones that related to the particular patterns we knew were related to this campaign. But actually, in this case, the numbers were so high that it kind of dominated the overall landscape. So GameStop, some of you will remember there was a kind of campaign, when was it? Shortly after COVID, I think, targeting the US retailer GameStop. So this was an online campaign to manipulate the company's share price. And it was kind of an effort by a kind of campaign of people on Reddit to try and get one back at the man, I think, as they saw it, following an earlier phase of short selling. So that's where these big investors were predicting that the share price would drop. So the guys on Reddit decided, wouldn't it be funny actually if we actually kind of put together a campaign that actually drives the share price up, and then these guys all lose money. So they did that. It worked. And what actually happened off the back of that is that once GameStop got into the public eye and people were aware that these things were happening, actually what this happened is it triggered a rise in unrelated infringements. So people were then registering domains containing GameStop and also share, stock, and invest. They were kind of taking advantage of the campaign that was going on to try and drive people to invest through their own fraudulent investment sites. And actually, again, you can see really interesting. So the graph on the bottom left, you can see that the numbers of infringements on the graph, which I think is the blue line, tracks almost exactly the progress of the campaign, which we're kind of using the share price over time as a proxy. So again, really, this is another indication that what we quite often see is high-profile events targeting a particular organization tend to trigger subsequent spikes in infringements against that or related organizations. And really what's happening there is the infringers are taking advantage of the increased interest, the increased levels of search relating to those brands to drive users to their own fraudulent or infringing content. We've seen that for so many different things. We've seen it for the COVID pandemic, targeting healthcare providers. We've seen it for the World Cup. We've seen it for the Olympics. Really, this is something, whenever there's any increased interest in anything, infringers will take advantage of that and they will build scams relating to the thing that people are interested in. Going back now to something a bit more domain flavored. So one of the new GTLDs released in the last year was .zip. I'm sure many of you will be familiar. It entered its sunrise period in 2023, and actually 30,000 domains were registered within the first 2 months. However, what we did see amongst those initial registrations is there was a lot of bad activity as well. There were a lot of phishing attacks, so there were well-documented campaigns against Microsoft, Google, Okta, and various others. And actually, several hundred of the domains that were registered in the first few weeks also contained high-risk phishing or malware-related keywords, so things like update, install, download, invoice, and so on. So what was happening here? Really what was happening is that .zip was, you might argue, a pretty poorly thought out choice for a new GTLD extension, simply because it provides the potential for confusion with file names. And a lot of infringers and kind of online criminals kind of latched onto this and thought, actually, if we register a carefully selected domain name, because of the way browsers will handle things like file name requests and things, actually, it was a really great way of the fraudsters collecting information. So you might imagine, for example, if you register something like com.zip, someone on there who's trying to query, run a network query for something like a file name .com that's been zipped. Actually, if your browser doesn't quite handle that correctly, actually can drive that user's traffic to com.zip and they can harvest information that way. It's a little bit complicated, but hopefully it kind of gives you the idea. What we actually did see is that people had absolutely latched onto this, and we could see that the initial batch of registrations included all of those file name extensions as SLDs, second level domain names. So people were registering things like doc.zip, html.zip, all of these ways of kind of collecting traffic that way. Sorry, I said com earlier. I meant file name extension, not a domain name extension. What were those domains being used for? Well, a lot of them were being used to distribute malicious content. Going back to the thing I mentioned earlier about domain name entropy, actually, so this is two plots here. So the blue kind of distribution here is the domain name entropy of just a sort of set of randomly registered domain names. So that's just 1 day's worth of .com registrations. The red distribution is the .zip file data set. website data set, and you can see that they are much, much higher entropy domain names. What that means is that actually the .zip registrations contain a lot of domain names like this one, these very, very long strings .zip. That's actually the highest entropy domain in the data set, but we saw a lot of these kind of long random strings being registered as domain names. And that's something that we do typically see when people are using automated registrations to be used for malicious activity. So that's why it's kind of quite a useful proxy for sort of malicious activity. This is a really interesting case study just because I think the amount of information that we were able to pull out of it was quite striking to me. So this was a series of fraudulent e-commerce websites, so basically selling counterfeits. It was a single coordinated campaign and they were targeting loads and loads of different brands. So here's just four examples within the data set targeting 4 well-known brands, all counterfeit, all fraudulent. We know that they were linked to each other because they used similar site templates, similar characteristics and so on. Actually, this was part of a case that at Stobbs, we worked on a referral to UK law enforcement to have these sites taken down. And as part of that, they kind of wanted us to do a bit of a deep dive into sort of what was going on within this data set and how much money these fraudsters were potentially making. As part of that, we looked at this site. So what happened is that when somebody, a victim, tried to make a purchase from one of these fraudulent sites, they were then sent an email containing a link to a scam tracking site, basically saying they needed to make a payment to process the delivery of their item. Obviously just a scam, no items being sent. This was just kind of a phishing exercise. What was really interesting in this is that the emails that the victims were sent contained a tracking number. The tracking number appeared in the URL of the page on the fraudulent site that they were sent to, and that page was personalized to them. So obviously the fraudsters knew who they were because they'd replied to an email. So, you know, the website says, hello, Rowan, you need to pay us $50 to get your item delivered. So what we're actually able to do is we're able to loop through all of the pages on this site just by varying that ID number and to see how many active pages had been used and how much money was being requested on each one. This is a heat map of what that looked like. Again, don't worry too much. So what we did is we realized that there had been a block of about 1.4 million different pages being used on that site. Each of these rectangular panels is 100,000 of those pages. And then within each of those, we looked at the blocks of 50 pages, which are the little squares, and we've color-coded that as to how many of those 50 pages were being actively used. So really, again, the thing to take away is that this is not a uniform distribution, it's quite patchy. So actually the method of use of the site was changing over time. The blocks were being more intensively used at the beginning, which is why you've got the dark colors there, and less intensively used at the end. The really interesting bit is this one. So sort of because everything was dated as well, we were able to sort of look at the trends over time. So the left-hand graph is showing the daily numbers of active pages that have been used as part of this scam. And the right-hand graph is showing the mean payment requested per page. Again, the thing to take away from this is that out of that block of 1.4 million pages that could have been used, about 900,000 of them had been actively used, with a mean requested payment on each page of about $85. So what that tells us is that over the period of operation of this site, which was about 2 years, this site had attempted to steal something like $77 million. Now, obviously, we don't know how much of that was successful, but if we assume that maybe somewhere between 0.1% and 1% of the victims actually did make a payment, you know, it's quite possible that this single site during the period of its operation may have netted between somewhere like $77,000 and $770,000. You can do a bit more sort of deep diving into it. So each page on that website also gave a contact email address. So we're able to map the different contact email addresses that were used and when and how often they were used over time for the 2-year period. So again, that was all part of the information that we're able to pass on to law enforcement. Just kind of quickly stepping through some of the others. So this one is looking at the relationship between brand prominence and brand value. So we mentioned earlier that brand prominence is something that we can measure for any page we bring back, how many mentions of the brand, how prominent they are. As part of one of our landscape analysis, what we're interested in doing is, well, how related is brand prominence to brand value? So brand value is something that many companies will publish information on. This is actually from a company called Kantar, a business consultancy, who kind of quantify what a brand is worth. And really, as I say, what we're interested in doing is we collected a series of web pages that were generally related to talking about business, talking about different companies. And so I sort of saw on that, which companies tend to get mentioned most often? Is it the brands that are most valuable? Now, what you can see is, so these two graphs are sort of showing the same thing. The bottom right one is just a zoom in of the top left one. What you can see is there is a very sort of weak correlation between the two. In general, the more prominent brands tend to be the more valuable brands, but there are some sort of exceptions. And you know, this tells you a little bit about how the brands are being represented online. So the ones at the bottom right, so let me get this right. So these are the ones that are disproportionately more prominent than you would expect by virtue of their brand value. They tend to be dominated by the media and entertainment brands. So that will be things like the social media, the search companies, the technology brands. And that's probably just reflective of just how ubiquitous these brands generally are online, and the fact that we were explicitly looking for pages relating to business. So these companies that offer business services tend to be more sort of commonly mentioned. The ones at the top left, so the ones that are less prominent, tended to be the luxury brands. So really what that tells us is that that's probably reflective of the fact that they have high brand values generally, but also they're less reliant on things like search engine optimization. They don't need to sort of be all over the internet to get people to go to their websites. They get their business through kind of word of mouth. Domain landscape analysis. Sorry, I'm aware of time, so I'll try and chop through these pretty quickly because we've still got a few left. So this was looking at the proportion of domains across a series of domain name extensions and of different domain name lengths which are registered versus accessible. Again, I won't go through all the detail now, but the thing to say, and it won't surprise anyone, is that short domain names across common domain name extensions, there's almost none left. So they're almost all, so all 234.com domains are already registered. .5, there's a bit more of an availability, but all of the dictionary domain names are already taken. So again, this is kind of important when it comes to thinking about, you know, if you're launching a new brand, where do you target? I mean, and I guess the thing to take away here is, you know, there are, as we've said in some previous sessions, a lot of the good domains are already taken, if you like. So as a brand owner looking to launch a new brand, what do you do? Do you pick a longer or novel or more unusual brand name? Or do you move towards some of the other TLDs we've talking about? So some of the repurposed TLDs, .ai, .io that we've been mentioning in previous sessions. This, I think, is the last case study, but it goes over a few slides, so please indulge me. So this is looking at blockchain. Obviously, no presentation here would be complete without mentioning blockchain and AI, which I'll come to at the very, very end. So this is looking at registrations of blockchain domains. It's actually not the full set of blockchain domains. It's a sub-data set where we're able to get data. So these are Ethereum blockchain domains, .eth. I won't go into exactly what blockchains are because we've talked about it on sort of some of the previous sessions. Really what we're able to do is look at the registration patterns over time. And I guess the thing to take away here is there was a period a couple of years ago where you were sort of seeing almost this land grab, if you like, of domains being registered. So there was a big peak in domain name registration activity, and that coincided with shorter domain names being registered. So really what we're seeing here is this was a period where the kind of short, desirable Ethereum blockchain domain names were being registered. What were they being registered for? We've talked a little bit in some of the other sessions about whether brand owners should be getting ahead of the curve. Clearly, infringers are already getting ahead of the curve. So these are the number of registrations over time with names containing any of the top 10 global brands. These are all, as far as we can tell, not official registrations. So these are being registered, blockchain domains being unusual in that they can contain all of these special characters. But what that does mean is it's very easy to create domain names that are deceptively similar to what could be official brand names, and that's what infringers seem to be doing. The other trend we're seeing in the blockchain domain names is things like this. This is the last case study that I wanted to show you. So this is 1,024 character domain name. So blockchain domains can be much longer than regular domains, and they can contain all of these special characters. And we started seeing things like this. So this is just the domain name. It's 1,024 characters, all consisting of colored squares. Anyone got any idea what this might be what it might represent? I won't keep you hanging too long because I'm already over time. what we noticed was 1,024 is, as I'm sure you'll be able to see, is 32 squared. If you actually write that domain name out in a 32 by 32 grid, you get that. So actually what we think we're now seeing is the emergence, I don't exactly know what it is, it's some sort of artwork. For me, it looks like the Mona Lisa. So we think people are registering these blockchain domains purely because of their attractiveness as a domain name in its own right, and they're kind of selling and trading them as artworks, a bit like used to be done with NFTs. We're seeing lots of these different things, and lots of them are infringing different types of IP. So you can see Pokemon characters, Donkey Kong characters, and this may be sort of one of the new kind of big areas of infringement. That's it really. I'll wrap up. Obviously, summary. So really, we've just talked about the different ways in which analysis can be applied. We haven't talked about return on investment, but we can apply these similar analytic ideas to work out the return on investment of brand protection programs. There's a few frameworks, which I won't go into here, but I can talk to anyone if they're interested. And AI, obviously, because no modern presentation would be complete without some reference to AI. We've talked again in some of the previous sessions about where we may see AI growing in future. I think we're already seeing infringers using it more. It gives them a lower entry barrier to be able to create convincing phishing sites, malware, and so on. Generative AI itself raises a number of questions over sort of IP ownership. But, you know, on the other hand, the good guys can use AI in brand protection in a range of different ways. There's some ideas there. I won't talk through them now, but again, if anyone wants to talk about any of that afterwards, then just give me a shout. And that's it. That's me. All of this information can be got at either through one of those sources or through me, who you can contact at those sources. And that's it. Thank you for your time.
David, awesome job.